July 30th, 1975. A hot summer afternoon in suburban Detroit. Cars rolled through crowded streets, restaurants filled with lunch customers, workers headed home, families went about their day. Everything seemed normal. But somewhere in a parking lot, one of the most powerful men in America was about to disappear forever. His name was Jimmy Hoffa, a labor leader, a kingmaker, a man feared by politicians, respected by workers, and watched closely by the FBI. At 2:45 p.m., Jimmy Hoffa stood alone outside the Machis Red Fox restaurant. He was waiting for a meeting he believed would settle a dispute, a meeting with men he had known for years. The meeting never happened, at least, not officially. Minutes later, Jimmy Hoffa vanished. No confirmed witnesses, no body, no crime scene, no confession, just questions. Questions that have haunted America for decades. But to understand how a man this powerful could simply disappear, we have to go back. Back before the investigations, back before the mob allegations, back before prison, back to the beginning. Who was Jimmy Hoffa? February 14th, Brazil, Indiana. A boy named James Riddle Hoffa entered the world. No one could have imagined what he would become. His father worked as a coal miner, life was hard, money was scarce, and tragedy came early. When Jimmy was only 7 years old, his father died. The loss changed everything. His mother struggled to support the family. Soon, the Hoffas moved north to Detroit, a city growing fast. Factories roared. Assembly lines never stopped. Workers poured into the city looking for opportunity. Young Jimmy became one of them. By his teenage years, he was already working. Long hours, low pay, little protection. And like millions of workers during the Great Depression, he saw something that made him angry. The people doing the hardest jobs had the least power. That anger would become his mission. During the 1930s, Jimmy Hoffa began organizing workers, not from an office, not from a boardroom, but from loading docks, warehouses, truck terminals. He learned quickly. Workers respected strength, and Hoffa had plenty of it. He negotiated, he pressured employers, he demanded better wages, better hours, better treatment, sometimes peacefully, sometimes aggressively. But it worked. Membership grew, and so did Hoffa's influence. By the 1940s, his name was becoming known throughout organized labor. The Teamsters Union was expanding rapidly, and Jimmy Hoffa was climbing with it. Every victory brought more power, every contract brought more supporters, and every year, he became harder to ignore. Soon, Jimmy Hoffa was no longer just another union organizer. He was becoming a force, a man employers feared, a man workers trusted, a man who seemed willing to do whatever it took to win. By the early 1950s, America was booming, factories expanded, highways stretched across the country, and trucks carried nearly everything. The Teamsters Union sat at the center of it all. Control the truckers, and you controlled the movement of goods across America. Jimmy Hoffa understood that better than anyone. He worked tirelessly, traveling city to city, meeting workers, negotiating contracts, building alliances, growing the union's power, and it worked. Membership exploded. The Teamsters became one of the most powerful labor organizations in the country. Then, in 1957, everything changed. Jimmy Hoffa became president of the Teamsters. At just 44 years old, he now led more than 1 million workers. His influence stretched across the nation. Politicians wanted his support, businesses wanted his cooperation, workers saw him as their champion, but not everyone celebrated his rise, because by then, rumors followed Hoffa everywhere. Rumors of secret meetings, rumors of hidden deals, rumors involving organized crime. For years, federal investigators had been hearing the same allegations, that certain mob figures and certain union leaders were working together, that money was flowing through channels nobody fully understood, that the Teamsters pension fund one of the largest pools of money in America, was being used in ways that raised serious questions. Nothing was simple, nothing was clear, but one thing was certain. The FBI was watching, and so was a young government lawyer named Robert Kennedy. At first, few people imagined how important that name would become. But Robert Kennedy had made Hoffa a priority. He believed corruption existed deep inside organized labor, and he intended to expose it. The conflict that followed would become one of the most famous feuds in American history. Kennedy versus Hoffa, government versus union power. Two men, two enormous egos, and neither willing to back down. As the years passed, the pressure intensified. Congressional hearings filled television screens. Newspapers covered every accusation, every denial, every confrontation. Hoffa remained defiant, handing his influence to his supporters. He was a hero, a fighter, a man who delivered results to his enemies. He represented something much darker, something hidden beneath the public image, something dangerous. The battle lines had been drawn, and soon, the fight would become personal, very personal, because Robert Kennedy was no longer just another investigator. He was becoming one of the most powerful men in Washington, and he had no intention of letting Jimmy Hoffa escape his sights. The collision between these two men was now inevitable, and when it came, it would change both of their lives forever. By the late 1950s, Jimmy Hoffa had reached the top. Millions of workers answered to the Teamsters. His influence stretched from coast to coast. He could shut down industries, pressure corporations, influence elections. Few labor leaders had ever held that much power. But in Washington, a new threat was emerging. Robert Kennedy, young, aggressive, relentless. Kennedy wasn't interested in Hoffa's popularity. He wasn't impressed by union victories. He wanted answers. For years, investigators had heard stories about corruption, stories about organized crime, stories about money moving through the Teamsters, and Robert Kennedy intended to find out if they were true. Soon, the Senate's investigations into labor corruption intensified. Television cameras rolled. Reporters filled hearing rooms. Americans watched as powerful figures were questioned under oath, and sitting at the center of it all was Jimmy Hoffa. The two men despised each other. Hoffa viewed Kennedy as arrogant, a privileged outsider, someone who knew nothing about the lives of working people. Kennedy viewed Hoffa as dangerous, a man he believed had built power through intimidation and corruption. Every hearing became a battlefield. Every appearance became a confrontation. Questions turned into arguments. Arguments turned into public spectacles. The nation watched, and neither man backed down. Behind closed doors, the conflict became even more intense. Kennedy assembled teams of investigators. Agents followed leads. Witnesses were interviewed. Financial records were examined. The government was determined to bring Hoffa down, but Hoffa remained confident. Time after time, investigations failed to destroy him. Charges came and went, yet he continued leading the Teamsters. His supporters saw him surviving every attack, and that only strengthened their loyalty to many workers. The government's pursuit of Hoffa looked personal to many investigators. The reason was simple: they believed Hoffa was guilty. Years passed, the pressure never stopped. Then finally, the government found an opening, an opportunity, a case they believed could succeed. In 1964, everything changed. Federal prosecutors charged Hoffa in separate criminal cases. One involved allegations of jury tampering. The other involved fraud connected to union affairs. This time, the evidence was stronger, the pressure was greater, and the consequences would be enormous. The trials dominated headlines. Day after day, Americans followed every development. For Hoffa, the stakes could not have been higher. If convicted, he could lose everything: his freedom, his power, his future. The man who had spent decades building an empire. now faced the possibility of watching it all collapse. The verdict arrived, guilty, then another verdict, guilty again. The courtroom battles were over. The government had finally done what many believed was impossible. Jimmy Hoffa had been convicted. For Robert Kennedy, it was a major victory. For Hoffa, it was the beginning of the end, or so it seemed. Because even as the prison sentence approached, Jimmy Hoffa was already thinking about something else, his return, his comeback, and the people who might stand in his way. Soon, he would enter federal prison, but prison would not change him. If anything, it would make him even more determined, and that determination may have ultimately sealed his fate. If organized crime was one threat to Jimmy Hoffa, Robert Kennedy was another. And unlike the mob, Kennedy wasn't operating in the shadows. He was coming straight at him, publicly, relentlessly, and with the full power of the United States government behind him. By the late 1950s, Robert Kennedy had become chief counsel for the Senate's Select Committee on Improper Activities in Labor and Management. The name was long, the mission was simple: expose corruption wherever it existed. And no target fascinated Kennedy more than Jimmy Hoffa. The two men couldn't have been more different. Kennedy came from privilege, political power, elite schools, national influence. Hoffa came from loading docks, union halls, factory neighborhoods, and decades of hard fights. Whereas everything that was wrong with America, the hatred was immediate, and it was personal. When Hoffa appeared before Senate investigators, the exchanges were explosive. Kennedy fired questions, Hoffa fired back. Neither man blinked, neither man backed down. Television cameras captured every moment. Americans watched two powerful personalities collide, again and again and again. The hearings became national events. To Hoffa's supporters, he looked fearless, a working-class fighter refusing to be bullied. To his critics, he looked arrogant, defiant, a man with something to hide. Meanwhile, Kennedy was building files, thousands of pages, witness statements, financial records, surveillance reports, investigative leads. The government was no longer simply watching Hoffa, it was hunting him. Every business deal was examined, every associate scrutinized, every movement tracked. The FBI devoted enormous resources to the effort. Agents followed Hoffa across the country. Wiretaps were authorized. Informants were recruited. For years, the government searched for a case strong enough to bring him down, and for years, Hoffa survived. Charges failed. Witnesses disappeared. Jurors couldn't agree. Some cases collapsed entirely. Each victory only strengthened Hoffa's reputation. He began to believe he was untouchable, maybe even unbeatable, but the pressure never stopped. Behind the scenes, Kennedy remained obsessed, even after becoming Attorney General of the United States. His focus on Hoffa continued. Some critics would later accuse Kennedy of making Hoffa a personal vendetta. Others argued he was simply doing his job. Whatever the truth, the battle consumed both men. Then, finally, the government caught a break. Investigators uncovered evidence that Hoffa had attempted to influence members of a jury during an earlier criminal trial. It was exactly the kind of case prosecutors needed: direct, understandable, and difficult to explain away. In 1964, Jimmy Hoffa went on trial. The courtroom was packed. Reporters filled every available seat. Outside, supporters gathered. Inside, prosecutors laid out their case. Witnesses testified. Evidence was presented. The tension was enormous. For Hoffa, everything was on the line: his reputation, his career, his freedom. Days turned into weeks. Then the verdict arrived. Guilty. The man who had defeated investigators for years had finally been convicted. But the government wasn't finished. A second conviction followed. This one involving fraud and misuse of union-related funds. Again, the verdict was guilty. The sentence was severe: 13 years in federal prison. For Robert Kennedy, it was the culmination of a years-long pursuit. For Jimmy Hoffa, it was a devastating blow. The most powerful labor leader in America was headed to prison. But prison would not end Jimmy Hoffa's story. In many ways, it would make the mystery even bigger, because even behind bars, he was already planning his return, and that return would eventually place him on a collision course with forces far more dangerous than the federal government. For Jimmy Hoffa, the worst was still ahead. March 7th, 1967. Jimmy Hoffa walked through the gates of a federal prison. The cameras were waiting. Reporters shouted questions. Photographers snapped pictures. One of the most powerful men in America was now inmate number 27886-039. The fall was stunning. Just a few years earlier, politicians had sought his support. Business leaders had feared his influence. Millions of workers had followed his leadership. Now, steel bars surrounded him, locked doors controlled his movements, and prison guards determined his schedule. For most people, that would have been the end. But Jimmy Hoffa was not most people, even behind bars. He refused to surrender. He studied, he planned, he wrote letters, and most importantly, he watched. Because outside prison walls, something was happening. The Teamsters Union was changing. The empire Hoffa had built was moving on without him. Leadership shifted, new alliances formed, new loyalties emerged, and slowly, the grip Hoffa once held over the organization began to weaken. That reality terrified him. Not prison, not the sentence, losing control. That was what bothered him most for years. Hoffa had lived at the center of power. Now others occupied that position. Others made the decisions. Others controlled the future, and Hoffa hated it. The longer he remained in prison, the more determined he became. He wasn't thinking about retirement. He wasn't thinking about a quiet life. He was thinking about one thing: a comeback. Meanwhile, the political landscape was changing. The 1960s ended. The nation entered a new decade. Presidents came and went. Movements rose and fell. And Jimmy Hoffa remained behind bars, waiting. Then, an opportunity appeared. Richard Nixon had become President of the United States, and discussions quietly began regarding Hoffa's future. Years passed. Lawyers worked behind the scenes. Supporters lobbied on his behalf. Family members hoped for good news. Then finally, it happened. December 23, 1971. President Richard Nixon commuted Jimmy Hoffa's sentence. After less than 5 years in prison, he was free. The announcement shocked many Americans. Some celebrated, others were furious. But there was a catch, a very important catch. Under the terms of the commutation, Hoffa was prohibited from participating in Teamsters Union activities until 1980. 9 years, 9 long years. For most people, the condition might have seemed reasonable. For Jimmy Hoffa, it was unacceptable. The restriction struck at the heart of everything he cared about. The union wasn't simply a job, it was his identity, his legacy, his life's work. And now, the government expected him to stay away. That was never going to happen. The moment he regained his freedom, Hoffa began planning. Quietly at first, then more openly, he contacted old allies, met former associates, reached out to supporters, and started laying the groundwork for a return. But America had changed, the Teamsters had changed, and many powerful people preferred things exactly the way they were. Some feared Hoffa's return would create chaos, others feared what he might reveal, and some had much more to lose. Because during Hoffa's years in prison, relationships had shifted, power had shifted, money had shifted. The men benefiting from that arrangement had no interest in watching Jimmy Hoffa reclaim his throne, yet Hoffa kept pushing. He filed lawsuits, gave interviews, made speeches, and publicly declared his intention to return. To stop What if he couldn't be controlled? What if he regained power? Those questions would soon lead to secret meetings, private conversations, and decisions made far from public view. By 1975, the tension had reached a breaking point. Jimmy Hoffa was 62 years old, determined, stubborn, and closer than ever to reclaiming influence. But time was running out, because somewhere in Detroit, a meeting was being arranged. A meeting that would become one of the most infamous appointments in American history, and once Jimmy Hoffa agreed to attend, there would be no turning back. Freedom. That was all Jimmy Hoffa wanted. At least, that's what he told people. But freedom wasn't enough. Not for Jimmy Hoffa, not after everything he had built, not after everything he had lost. The moment he stepped out of prison in 1971, his eyes were fixed on one thing: the Teamsters, the union he had spent decades building, the union he still believed belonged to him, the union he intended to reclaim, no matter what it took. At first, the campaign was quiet: private meetings, phone calls, conversations behind closed doors. Hoffa wanted to know who remained loyal, who could be trusted, who would stand with him when the fight began. Some old friends welcomed him back, others avoided him. That bothered Hoffa. He noticed it immediately. People who once rushed to take his calls now hesitated. People who once depended on him now acted distant. The world had moved on, and Jimmy Hoffa hated it. But if prison had taught him anything, it was persistence. So he pushed harder. He traveled, met supporters, spoke publicly, and repeatedly declared that he intended to return to power. The reaction was immediate. Current Teamsters leadership wanted stability. They didn't want a civil war. They didn't want headlines. And they definitely didn't want Jimmy Hoffa returning to the spotlight. But Hoffa wasn't listening. The more resistance he encountered, the harder he pushed. Every obstacle became another reason to continue. Every warning became a challenge. Every criticism fueled his determination. Soon, the conflict became impossible to ignore. Court filings appeared. Political maneuvering intensified. Union officials scrambled to protect their positions. Meanwhile, Hoffa's name returned to newspaper headlines again and again and again. The comeback had begun. But there was another problem, a much bigger problem. The people who allegedly helped shape the balance of power inside organized labor weren't interested in change. For years, arrangements had existed, relationships had developed, business had continued, and many powerful figures preferred things exactly as they were. Hoffa's return threatened all of it. Some believed he talked too much, others believed he knew too much, and a few worried that if Hoffa regained control, he might expose secrets that were supposed to remain buried forever. Yet Hoffa remained fearless, or perhaps reckless. Friends warned him, associates advised caution, some even suggested retirement. Enjoy your freedom, enjoy your family, walk away. But Jimmy Hoffa didn't spend a lifetime fighting to walk away. He intended to win. By 1974, the atmosphere around him had changed. Meetings became tense, conversations became guarded, promises became harder to trust. The closer Hoffa moved toward power, the more resistance he encountered, and yet he refused to stop. Then came 1975, the most important year of his life, and the last. By now, the pressure was enormous. Hoffa was still campaigning for influence, still challenging those who stood in his way, still trying to reclaim the position he believed belonged to him. But behind the scenes, something else was happening. Conversations were taking place, quiet conversations, private conversations, the kind that never appear in official records, the kind that leaves no paper trail. And somewhere inside those conversations, Jimmy Hoffa's future may have been decided. Then came word of a meeting that promised an opportunity, a chance to settle differences, a chance to resolve conflicts, a chance to move forward. The meeting would take place in suburban Detroit, at a restaurant Hoffa knew well, a place called the Machus Red Fox. The date was set, July 30th, 1975. Hoffa agreed to attend. Perhaps he believed a breakthrough was possible. Perhaps he believed he could still negotiate. Perhaps he believed he was walking into a routine meeting. If so, he was terribly mistaken. Because on that summer afternoon, Jimmy Hoffa would keep his appointment, and after that, the next chapter of this story would become one of the greatest mysteries in American history. July 30th, 1975, Wednesday, Detroit, Michigan. The sun was already high, the air was warm, traffic moved steadily through the suburbs. To everyone else, it was an ordinary day. For Jimmy Hoffa, it would be his last. That morning, nothing seemed unusual. No signs of panic, no signs of fear, no indication that history was about to change. Hoffa was 62 years old, still determined, still fighting, still pursuing the comeback he had spent years planning. And that afternoon, he had a meeting, an important one. According to Hoffa, he was expecting to meet two men he had known for years, men connected to disputes that needed settling. The meeting place was familiar, the Machus Red Fox restaurant, a popular restaurant in Bloomfield Township, a suburb north of Detroit. Hoffa had been there before. There was nothing unusual about the location, nothing suspicious, at least not on the surface. Earlier in the day, he spoke with family members, made routine calls, handled ordinary business. Everything appeared normal. Then, he got into his car, a green 1974 Pontiac Grandville, and headed toward the restaurant. He arrived shortly before 2 p.m. The parking lot was busy. Customers came and went. Employees moved through their shifts. Nobody knew they were witnessing the beginning of one of America's greatest mysteries. At first, Hoffa waited patiently. Minutes passed, no meeting. More minutes passed, still nothing. The men he expected had not arrived, or so it seemed. Hoffa became irritated. People who knew him understood something important. Jimmy Hoffa hated waiting, especially when he believed someone was wasting his time. As the clock moved forward, his frustration grew. At approximately 2:15 p.m., Hoffa placed a call to his wife, Sally Hoffa. He sounded annoyed. According to later accounts, he complained that the people he was supposed to meet hadn't shown up. He didn't sound frightened. He didn't sound concerned. He sounded angry. It was the kind of complaint a husband might make after being kept waiting. Nothing more, nothing less. The conversation ended, and Hoffa continued waiting. Witnesses would later remember seeing him, standing near his car, walking through the parking lot, looking around, checking for arriving vehicles, waiting, always waiting. Then, something happened, something that remains disputed to this day. Some witnesses believed Hoffa eventually approached another vehicle. Others reported seeing him speaking with someone. A few accounts suggested he entered a car, but no single version of events has ever been universally accepted, and that uncertainty would become the heart of the mystery because sometime after 2:30 p.m., Jimmy Hoffa disappeared, not gradually, not over days, not over weeks, instantly. One moment he was there, the next, he was gone. No confirmed public sighting has ever been verified after that afternoon. No security cameras captured his movements, no photographs recorded what happened. No definitive witness stepped forward with the answer. Just a gap, a blank space in history. As afternoon turned into evening, concern began to grow. Calls went unanswered. Expected appearances were missed. Family members became worried. Friends started asking questions, and slowly, a terrifying realization emerged. Jimmy Hoffa had vanished. The following morning, his car was still sitting in the restaurant parking lot, abandoned, waiting, like a silent witness. But the man who drove it there was nowhere to be found. Investigators would soon descend on the scene. The FBI, local police, federal agents, reporters, everyone wanted answers. But from the very beginning, the case seemed different, almost impossible. There was no body, no crime scene, no murder weapon, no confession, only questions. And with every passing hour, those questions became harder to answer. Because somewhere between arriving at the Machis Red Fox and leaving that parking lot, Jimmy Hoffa had vanished from the face of the earth, and the search for the truth was only beginning. The moment Jimmy Hoffa failed to return home, the clock started ticking. At first, family members hoped there was a simple explanation, a delayed meeting, a forgotten appointment, a misunderstanding. But as the hours passed, that hope faded, fast. By the next morning, the situation was impossible to ignore. One of the most recognizable men in America had vanished, and nobody knew where he was. The FBI moved quickly. Agents arrived in Detroit. Interviews began immediately. Witnesses were identified. Phone records were examined. Timelines were reconstructed. Every minute of Hoffa's final day came under scrutiny. Investigators started with the obvious question: who was Jimmy Hoffa supposed to meet? The answer led them toward familiar names, names that had appeared around Hoffa for years, names linked to organized crime, names that would haunt the investigation for decades. Agents interviewed associates, friends, family members, union officials, restaurant employees, anyone who might have seen something, anyone who might know something. But the deeper investigators looked, the stranger the case became. There was no ransom demand, no credible sightings, no evidence suggesting Hoffa had voluntarily disappeared. Everything pointed toward one possibility: murder, but proving it would be another matter entirely. Then investigators focused on a man whose name would become permanently attached to the mystery: Charles Chucky O'Brien, a longtime associate of Jimmy Hoffa, someone Hoffa had known for years, someone many believed remained close to him. As investigators reconstructed the events surrounding July 30th, O'Brien's movements attracted attention. So did a vehicle connected to the investigation, a dark maroon 1975 Mercury Marquis Brougham. The car became one of the most discussed pieces of evidence in the case. Agents examined it carefully, searching for anything that might reveal what happened after Hoffa disappeared. Years later, forensic testing would uncover evidence suggesting Hoffa may have been inside the vehicle. The discovery reignited public interest. But even then, questions remained. Lots of questions. Questions that could not be answered conclusively. Meanwhile, the FBI pursued another avenue: organized crime. From the beginning, many investigators suspected the mafia. The theory seemed plausible. Hoffa had enemies, powerful enemies, men with influence, men with resources, men who may have viewed Hoffa's comeback as a threat. As agents dug deeper, the same names surfaced repeatedly: Anthony Tony Provenzano, Anthony Tony Jack Giacalona, Joseph Zerilli, and other figures allegedly connected to organized crime networks. Yet suspicion alone wasn't enough. The FBI needed evidence, hard evidence, and that proved frustratingly difficult. Witnesses changed stories, potential informants became uncooperative, leads disappeared, rumors multiplied. The investigation expanded. Thousands of interviews were conducted. Countless tips poured in. Some sounded credible, many did not. Over the years, authorities searched fields, garages, warehouses, backyards, construction sites, remote properties, landfills, even riverbanks. Each new lead generated headlines, each new search raised hopes, and each failed search deepened the mystery. Then came another troubling realization. Many investigators began believing that Hoffa had been killed almost immediately after disappearing, not days later, not weeks later, hours later, possibly even minutes. If that theory was correct, then whoever carried out the crime had planned it carefully, very carefully, because no body was found, No murder scene was discovered, and no physical evidence ever emerged strong enough to support criminal charges. It was as if Jimmy Hoffa had simply ceased to exist. As years turned into decades, the investigation became one of the largest unsolved cases in FBI history. Retired agents continued speaking about it, journalists continued writing about it, authors published books, filmmakers produced documentaries, and still, no definitive answer emerged. The mystery refused to die, because somewhere, someone knew what happened. Someone knew how Jimmy Hoffa disappeared. Someone knew where he went. The problem was, they weren't talking, and with every passing year, the chances of uncovering the truth grew smaller. Yet the story was far from over, because after the investigation came something else. Theories, hundreds of them, some believable, some absurd, and one question that still fascinates America to this day: what really happened to Jimmy Hoffa? For decades, America searched for Jimmy Hoffa, not the man, the answer, the one piece of evidence that could finally explain what happened on July 30th, 1975, but that answer never came. Instead, there were theories, lots of them. Some emerged from law enforcement, others came from journalists, former mob associates, authors, informants, and people who claimed to know the truth. One theory suggested Hoffa was murdered shortly after leaving the Moshus Red Fox parking lot, taken to another location, killed within hours. His body disposed before investigators even realized he was missing. Another theory claimed he was transported across state lines, buried in a remote location, a place that has never been discovered. Others believed he was cremated, completely destroyed, leaving behind no physical evidence. Then there were the famous rumors, the stories that captured public imagination, claims that Hoffa was buried beneath a football stadium, hidden under concrete, entombed beneath buildings, buried under highways, stuffed inside industrial foundations, promising leads. Ground was excavated, properties were searched, advanced technology was deployed. Nothing. Again and again. Nothing. Yet many former investigators eventually reached the same conclusion. Jimmy Hoffa was murdered, not kidnapped, not hiding, not living under a new identity. Murdered. The real mystery wasn't whether he died. The real mystery was where his remains went, and who made sure they would never be found. By the late 1970s, the chances of solving the case had already begun to fade. Witnesses died, memories faded, evidence disappeared. Time became the enemy. Then, in 1982, a legal milestone arrived. 7 years had passed since Hoffa vanished, without proof that he was alive. The law reached its conclusion. Jimmy Hoffa was officially declared dead. There was no funeral, no body, no grave, no final goodbye, just a legal declaration and a mystery that remained unsolved. Yet Hoffa's story refused to disappear. His name became part of American culture, referenced in movies, television shows, books, documentaries, conspiracy theories, and endless debates. Even people born decades after his disappearance recognized the name Jimmy Hoffa, the man who vanished, the union boss who walked into a parking lot and never came back. But perhaps the reason this story still fascinates us isn't the crime itself, it's what the crime represents: power, influence, secrets, and the uncomfortable possibility that some mysteries are never meant to be solved. Because despite thousands of interviews, millions of dollars spent, decades of investigation, and countless theories, nobody has ever been convicted of Jimmy Hoffa's murder. Nobody has ever produced his body. Nobody has ever provided definitive proof of what happened that afternoon. The truth remains hidden, somewhere, maybe in forgotten memories, maybe in sealed files, maybe in secrets carried to the grave. And that's what makes this case different. Most mysteries eventually fade. This one didn't. Because every unanswered question creates another, and every passing year makes the silence louder. On July 30th, 1975, Jimmy Hoffa walked into history not because of what he accomplished, not because of the power he held, but because of what happened next, or perhaps what didn't happen. He never came home. He never called again. He never appeared again. One of the most powerful men in America simply vanished, and nearly 50 years later, the question remains exactly where it began. What really happened to Jimmy Hoffa? Maybe someday, someone will finally answer. Until then, the disappearance of Jimmy Hoffa remains one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in American history.